My thanks to the mayor for his introduction, and I would also like to thank the Chacao Theater and the Chacao Municipality and Backroom Caracas for hosting my visit to Venezuela. It is a great pleasure to be here. This is my first visit to Venezuela, and I hope it will not be my last. The background to my career is that all my life I wanted to be an archaeologist. I was fascinated by ancient civilizations. And so a number of years ago, I did a study of why ancient societies would often collapse, the collapse of the Roman Empire being perhaps the classic example. As I was doing this study, I realized that what I was learning was not just about ancient societies, but it had implications for our own way of life as well. And I will talk about some of those today. But first, we're going to start talking about the collapses of ancient civilizations. Collapse is a topic that periodically becomes popular. You can see in these two magazines here, especially during times when we tend to worry about our future. When I give talks on the topic, I'm often asked about our own future and what collapses tell us about ourselves, whether perhaps our own societies will go from this to this. So let us start by asking, what is collapse? In English, it's a common term with many colloquial meanings, as well as some technical meanings. And it's often used imprecisely for everything from what happens to an overloaded bridge to what a tired person does at the end of a hard day. What happened in ancient societies when they collapsed was that they rapidly simplified, rapidly lost what we call complexity. The societies that resulted had fewer parts, they were less well organized, they were often smaller, they were less capable, and they often lost great traditions of art, architecture, and literature. And what resulted is sometimes called Dark Ages. Collapses have been common in history, surprisingly common. When I did a study a number of years ago, I found about 24 cases, and I'll just mention some of the more well-known cases. The Maya civilization of the Guatemala lowlands, of course, the Hittite Empire of Anatolia, the Roman Empire, the Hittite Empire of Anatolia, Minoan civilization of Crete, and the Mycenaean civilization of Greece. Collapse of the Western Zhou dynasty in China, the Harappan civilization of what's now the Indus River Valley, Old Kingdom Egypt, Olmec civilization in Veracruz, the southeast of Mexico, Teotihuacan, Awari and Tiahuanaco in what is now Peru. And in the New World, there are examples also. A site called Casas Grandes in northern Mexico, a site called Cahokia, which is in the Mississippi River Valley in the United States near the city of St. Louis. And this is an illustration of what Cahokia once looked like. Chacoan society in the southwestern United States, in the northwestern part of the state of New Mexico. This is one of the ruins of Chacoan society. And the Society of the Hohokam people in southern Arizona. Various kinds of catastrophes, and these are very popular today. For example, a change in climate. Scholars today who are concerned about climate change like to think that perhaps climate change caused past societies to collapse. It's very common and it's particularly popular today. Internal conflict is a perpetually popular explanation of collapse. Conflict between classes, peasant revolts, things like this. Economic explanations, change in trade routes, insufficient resources, and so forth. Now, I wanted to study collapse largely because I thought that existing theories were not adequate to explain it. I'll briefly discuss why, because it leads to a lesson about the nature of science. One of the most common explanations is barbarian invasions. The problem with this explanation is, why would you destroy the things that make conquest profitable? And also, how can a weaker society overcome a stronger one? Mystical factors? Mystical factors rely on value judgments. Rise, fall, terms like decline, vigor, and so forth. These are terms that are imprecise and should be avoided in science. They are difficult to define, and they really are relative to the values of particular societies and individuals. Moral decay as a reason for collapse. My favorite critique of this explanation came from a scholar by the name of Robert Adams, and he wrote, and I quote, "We cannot seriously suppose that major political structures disintegrate because of anyone's indulgence in excessive food, drink, or sex." Catastrophes. Catastrophes don't explain anything. Societies encounter catastrophes all the time. Sometimes they collapse and sometimes they don't. So we have to ask, why do some societies withstand catastrophes while others don't? Internal conflict. Social conflict, as a scholar by the name of Ashok Gua pointed out, is the price of the existence of society itself, and I'm quoting him. Social conflict is normal. It is universal. It will never go away. It cannot be an explanation for why societies collapse, because it is perpetual. Peasant rebellions. This is an explanation that you see, for example, in the collapse of the Roman Empire or in the collapse of Maya civilization. The problem is that peasants normally rebel when they are allied with disaffected intellectuals. And this means that a new hierarchy is always implicit in peasant rebellions. Okay, a chance concatenation of events. Well, this doesn't explain a phenomenon that is general and recurrent, and we know has happened again and again in history. All of these collapses cannot have happened due simply to chance. Depletion of resources. Collapse involves resources, as I will be explaining shortly, but resources alone don't explain collapse. For example, the Abbasid Caliphate of Mesopotamia collapsed in the 11th to 12th centuries AD, and it's often thought that the reason for this was because they irrigated their fields too heavily and caused the fields to become impregnated with salt, and that this destroyed agricultural production. But you have to ask, why would the rulers behave this way? It is not a complete explanation of collapse. So where does that leave us? So many failed explanations. There are records from ancient Mesopotamia and ancient China from about 1000 BC where writers tried to explain why dynasties collapse. Now, if we consider these writings as ancestral to the modern literature on collapse, we have 3,000 years of trying to explain collapse but failing to do so. Why is this? Part of the reason is because we value complex societies, calling them civilizations. We live in complex societies ourselves. Complex societies have great traditions of art, architecture, literature, and usually wonderful technology. So losing these things leads scholars to ask what went wrong. And this leads naturally to a focus on invasions, natural disasters, social unrest, and topics like that. But what went wrong is the wrong question, and naturally it has led to inadequate answers. And there's some interesting lessons for science from this. 3,000 years of failed explanations. There must be something of a world record in that. Sometimes the hardest part of science is asking the right question. Naturally, it has led to, in this case, inadequate answers when we have asked the wrong question, when we have asked what went wrong. The problem is that it's hard to know when you are asking the right question. There are no guidelines to asking the right question. It can depend on inspiration or sometimes just on a hunch. There is an old saying that science is 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration. And this is true, but without the inspiration, the perspiration may be wasted. And in this case, scholars wasted 3,000 years of perspiration asking the wrong question about why societies collapsed. So how do we go about asking a better question? We start with the understanding that collapse is the rapid simplification of a society. We try to avoid value judgments, and we try not to prefer complex societies to simpler ones. We try not to establish a preference for civilizations over other kinds of societies. And then the question shifts from what went wrong to why do societies change in complexity? This is a question that is value neutral, and thus it's a suitable question for scientific analysis. The question is simple and clear, which is an advantage, but it's not easy to answer. To answer it, we first need to understand some things about complexity in human societies and about how complexity evolves. The evolution of social complexity concerns the change from societies that were small with few distinctions other than those based in biology, in age and sex, to societies that are large, differentiated, and highly integrated. For example, hunter-gatherer societies tend to have only a few dozen kinds of social personalities, while in contrast, modern censuses recognize 10,000 to 20,000 distinct occupations. So looked at this way, there are two elements to cultural complexity. The first is diversification and specialization in structure, in the parts that comprise a society. These are social roles, institutions, technologies, activities, and bits of information. And secondly, there is increasing integration and control of behavior. Complex societies are highly organized, which is to say that they integrate and control people's behavior. The irony of complexity, and this is a little counterintuitive, is that complexity actually simplifies. At least in English, we tend to think of complexity as a synonym for complicated. But complex societies actually simplify. As you elaborate structure and control, you simplify and channel people's behavior. And this is how complexity works. There are many misconceptions about complexity. One is that complexity is voluntary, that it develops simply because people invent things. This belief is deeply embedded in the cosmology of modern societies, and we describe it by the term progress. The problem with this belief is that complexity costs. In any living system, as you differentiate structure and increase in organization, there is always a metabolic cost. This cost is ultimately paid in the currency of energy that the system must extract from its environment. But we humans think of the cost in terms of other kinds of currencies such as time, money, taxes, and annoyance. Now, in understanding why human societies became more complex over time, it's important to remember that in the past, increasing the complexity of a society meant that people had to work harder. We're unaware of this today because to us, complexity appears to be free. We pay for it through fossil fuels. In the past, though, the cost of complexity must always have acted to constrain increases in complexity. But if complexity costs, and if people are averse to unnecessary labor, we are left with the fundamental question: why, in human history, over the past 5,000 years, has complexity seemed commonly to increase? The reason is that increasing complexity is a primary way that we solve problems. Confronted with problems, our solutions tend to evolve more elaborate technologies, proliferation of specializations and social roles, processing more information, or engaging in new kinds of activities. To give a couple of quick examples, to deal with the problem of terrorism, we in the countries that are subject to terrorism have created new government agencies and increased control over new types of behavior from which a threat might arise. These steps are increases in complexity undertaken to address a problem. The second example, to deal with problems of oil consumption and pollution, manufacturers now sell hybrid automobiles that have two means of propulsion where previously one was sufficient. It's an increase in complexity to solve a problem. So we adopt complexity to solve problems, but it has benefits and costs. Complexity, in other words, is an economic function, and I want to emphasize that again. Complexity has benefits and costs. It is an economic function. As with any economic function, the important factor is the ratio of benefits to costs. Complexity, in other words, is an investment. But the benefit-cost ratio of complexity is not constant. It changes as complexity grows. We tend, as human beings, always to pluck the low-lying fruit first, to choose the simplest solutions with the least cost first. Changes in the benefit-cost ratio of complexity can mean different futures for societies. In particular, as with any economic process, complexity in problem solving can reach the point known as diminishing returns, where you pay more and more for less and less. A prolonged period of diminishing returns to complexity in problem solving makes a society increasingly vulnerable to collapse. Firstly, fiscal weakness makes the society vulnerable to problems that it can no longer afford to solve. Secondly, the population becomes disaffected as complexity and costs increase, but problem solving becomes ineffective. We have both of these processes at work today in the problems we have had, for example, in responding to the economic crisis that began in 2008, and in how people react to this, and in many other areas. It is common in many countries that national governments seem to be developing less and less effectiveness at solving problems. I'm going to illustrate this process in a historical case study, perhaps our best historical case study of collapse, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. When the Romans conquered a province, they would seize precious metals, works of art, and people. In an agricultural economy, these amounted to the accumulated surpluses of solar energy. In effect, Rome's expansion meant the conquest of sources of energy. Rome's expansion was initially highly profitable. For example, in 167 BC, The Romans captured the Macedonian treasury and thereafter eliminated taxation of themselves. After this, the conquered people paid the cost of further expansion. The state budget was doubled when the kingdom of Pergamon, in what's now Turkey, was annexed in 130 BC. When the Roman general Pompey conquered Syria, the budget was raised another 70%. When Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, he acquired so much gold that the value of gold in Rome fell by 36%. Now, our popular image of the Roman Empire is that it was enormously wealthy. But in fact, it had an economy based on solar energy and subsistence agriculture and was much like a poor country of today. A few people were fabulously wealthy, but most people were desperately poor. Subsistence agriculture paid 90% of the taxes, and 90% of the economy thus involved the production of energy. Because of this, once the phase of expansion was over, the government was chronically short of money. Because of this, the government was almost always short of funds. In 64 AD, right about here, the chart shows the silver content of the primary silver coin, the denarius, through time. It begins as a high-quality coin of 98 to 99% pure silver, and as you can see, the silver content deteriorates over time. The process begins in 64 AD when the Emperor Nero lowered the alloy from 98 to 93% silver. He did this for two reasons. The first was the cost of a war in the east with the Parthian Empire, and the second was the Great Fire of Rome of the year 64, when we are told that Nero fiddled while Rome burned. As you can see, this was the first step down a slippery slope that resulted 2 centuries later in a currency that was worthless and a government that was insolvent. Now, I can spare you a lot of history. We can skip a lot of this time period until we come to about the 3rd century AD. The crisis of the empire came in the half century from 235 to 284 AD. Fiscal distress coincided in the 3rd century with a 50-year crisis that nearly brought the empire to an end. There were repeated foreign invasions and civil wars. Emperors were continually overthrown. The average reign was 30 months. And that average includes one emperor who ruled for 15 years. If you take him out, the average reign is very short. At one time, the empire actually broke up into 3 parts, and it looked at this point like the Roman Empire was about to come to an end. Because of continuing fiscal problems, in the year 238, they introduced a new coin. It's this lower one here, called today the Antoninianus. This is a denarius, the original coin. This is the replacement coin, the Antoninianus. This was supposedly worth 2 of those, but it actually weighed only 1.5. And very often the mint would take in these kinds of coins as taxes, flatten them out and restrike them with a new image, and issue them as worth twice as much. So the government made a profit of 200% merely by collecting old coins and issuing new ones. Cities had to build new walls, and they also shrank in size. The city of Lyon, in what's now France, shrank from 160 hectares down to 20. Paris itself contracted to the Ile de la Cité, which is the island in the Seine River on which the Cathedral of Notre Dame now sits. The situation looked desperate, but it was rescued by a series of reforming emperors who emerged in the late and early 4th centuries. Their strategy was to increase the complexity and size of the main problem-solving institutions, the government and the army. Now, recall from what I said earlier that complexity consists of 2 dimensions, structure and organization, and the government increased both. The government subdivided provinces to prevent provincial governors from rebelling. They expanded the size of the government, and the number of capital cities went from 1 to at sometimes as many as 4. The empire was increasingly ruled by separate governments in the east and the west. They also doubled the size of the army and increased the proportion of cavalry being very expensive. If you've ever kept horses, you know how expensive they are. There were also increasing controls on behavior. Workers were frozen into hereditary occupations that the government deemed essential, including the army. If you were a soldier, your sons also had to be soldiers. The government conscripted workers and guilds for such things as shipping and building new walls around cities. Farmers were tied to their plots. Most remarkable of all, the government assessed every plot of land across the entire empire for tax. This is every field, every orchard, every pasture was assessed for tax. This all had to be done in a few years in an economy in which transport had to be almost primarily by land, which is slow and expensive, and the recording alone must have been an enormous task. This was all costly, as complexity is, and the government raised taxes to pay for it. Taxes apparently doubled and then doubled again. The tax rate was intrinsic to the land and the type of cultivation, and then there were also taxes on people. The tax on a person or on a plot of land had to be paid regardless of the actual yield. And I want to emphasize that point. Every plot of land had a level of tax assessed on it, and it didn't matter what the actual production of that plot of land was, the tax had to be paid. So if there was an early frost, or if crickets came and you lost your crop, it didn't matter. You still had to pay the tax. This was a severe burden on a population of subsistence producers. The government always had a backup on taxes. Villages were liable for taxes on their members. One village could be held liable for another. Tax obligations extended even to widows, orphans, and dowries. The result was that population could not recover from plagues in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Peasants had become unable to support large families. There are actually reports of peasants selling their children into slavery because they could not afford to feed them. This was a fairly common practice. Marginal lands went out of production because people could not pay the taxes on them. And there were continued fiscal problems. Many currency reforms were attempted with continued decline in value. This is a new coin, a very large bronze coin with a silver wash, just a silver covering, introduced in the year 296 at a weight of about 10 grams, and as you can see, over time, it simply declines and declines and declines in value. The currency debasements, of course, were inflationary, and some of the increases sound almost like 1920s Germany. People had to make payments carrying sacks of coins. And in fact, the coins from this period today are very abundant. Many millions of them have survived because so many millions of them had to be minted. In one sense, the Roman Empire, if we use an analogy from banking, we might say that the Roman Empire went from living off its interest, the interest being agricultural production, to consuming its capital resources, those being producing lands as in peasant population. The collapse was inevitable from the cost of solving problems. The problems the Romans faced was increasing the complexity on the basis of an energy supply that could not grow enough. Now, we have, to this point in time, avoided problems such as the Romans faced by basing our societies on fossil fuels. Or have we? This is just a little chart that I put together when I gave a talk like this in the United States, just showing the value of the Roman denarius compared to the value of the United States dollar. This is a particularly important chart. The gray bars show global recessions. The red line shows the real price of oil. And what the chart shows is that recessions regularly follow spikes in the price of oil. In the United States, whenever energy costs exceed 6% of gross domestic product, we slip into a recession. Energy, in other words, is very, very important to all economies. But when we talk about energy, it's important to understand that not all energy is equal. Some barrels of oil are worth more than others. And one of the most important concepts is what's called energy returned on energy investment, which in English comes under the acronym EROI, E-R-O-I. I hope you won't mind me using that acronym. Basically, it takes energy to get energy, and what we call EROI, energy returned on energy invested, is simply the ratio of what you get back over what you must spend. The key to the future of the way we live today is not the gross amount of oil that's left in the earth, but the energy return on finding it and getting it out. The chart shows the peak in U.S. oil production in 1970, although it's starting to turn up again because of hydraulic fracturing. In 1940, the United States produced oil and gas at an energy return of 100 to 1. For every barrel of oil that we would spend looking for more oil, we got 100 barrels back. That is now down to 15 to 1, and the trend is irreversible. My colleague Charles Hall estimates that in an industrial society, we need to have an energy return of at least 5 to 1 in order to maintain our way of life. The reason for this is because of the depletion of what's called easy oil. To give you an example, a little anecdote. In 1892, an unsuccessful prospector by the name of Edward Doheny found oil near Los Angeles at a depth of 140 meters. That in itself is not so unusual. The interesting part of the story is that he drilled the hole using the sharpened end of a eucalyptus tree. We will never again produce oil with sharpened eucalyptus trees. Declining energy return on investment forces us to use exploration and production technology that is increasingly complex and costly. The most capable rig today is a rig owned by Shell. It's known as Perdido. It can pump oil from 35 wells across 30 miles of ocean floor at a rate of up to 130,000 barrels a day, while simultaneously drilling new wells. Its deepest well lies in 9,600 feet of water, so let's call that about 3,000 meters. The Perdido platform cost $3 billion to build. And here's an illustration of Perdido with its arms snaking across the ocean floor. The reason why the Gulf oil spill happened, we're going to shift now to talking about the Gulf oil spill, is because in the United States at least, we have pretty much exhausted the reserves of easy oil. This means that we need increasingly complex technology to find and produce oil from the places where we can still find it, places that I refer to as deep, dark, cold, remote, and dangerous. We are now talking about finding oil off the coast of Greenland in the same environment that sank the Titanic. So declining energy return leads to increasing complexity and to higher risk. The cost of finding and producing oil is only the surface manifestation of a deeper challenge. That challenge is complexity. As in other human endeavors, solving problems in oil production generates increasing complexity. Complexity generates increasing costs and produces diminishing returns. Complexity also leads to high levels of risk. The book published in 1984 called Normal Accidents by the sociologist Charles Perrow that I think helps us to understand why the Deepwater Horizon blowout occurred. Perrow argued that accidents arise in complex technologies because of unintended interactions among the components, and because at the time of an accident, the very complexity of these systems makes it difficult for operators to understand what is happening. Perrow, of course, wrote his book at a time when technologies were much simpler than they are today. A good example is the wreck of the Torrey Canyon in 1960 off the coast of France. 1967, I'm sorry. The Torrey Canyon was carrying 119,000 tons of Kuwaiti crude oil, and some 50 miles of French coast and 120 miles of Cornish coast were contaminated, and around 15,000 seabirds were killed. And I'm going to read from an account of what happened, and I quote, "At 8:42, the master switched from automatic steering to manual and personally altered the course to port to steer 0 degrees north, and then switched back to automatic steering. At 8:45, the third officer, now under stress, observed a bearing, forgot it, and observed it again. The position now indicated that the Torrey Canyon was less than 1 nautical mile from the rocks ahead. The master ordered hard to port. The helmsman who had been standing by on the bridge ran to turn it. Nothing happened. He shouted to the master, who quickly checked the fuse. The fuse was all right. The master then tried to telephone the engineers to have them check the steering gear aft. A steward answered. Wrong number. He tried dialing again, and then noticed that the steering selector was on automatic control instead of manual. He switched it quickly to manual, and the vessel began to turn. Moments later, at 8:50, having turned only about 10 degrees, and while still doing her full speed of 15 3/4 knots, the vessel grounded on Pollard Rock. This was a normal accident, an accident caused by technology and confusion. And the Torrey Canyon, of course, was technologically simple compared to the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig. Normal accidents occur in systems so complex that in an emergency, operators cannot understand what is happening. Inevitably, they make mistakes, as happened, for example, in Chernobyl, the nuclear reactor that melted down in Ukraine. Subsequent investigations always blame operator error, when in fact the problem is unanticipated system interactions. Safety systems may actually worsen problems by adding more complexity. Complexity was clearly a part of the problem on the Deepwater Horizon, as reported in the New York Times. One safety system required flipping 30 switches, which workers in fear of their lives are not going to do. Normal accidents, in other words, are part of the cost of complexity in technology. It's predictable that they will happen from time to time. So to get back to the topic of my presentation today, and that title I gave you that I hope you found intriguing, what is the connection between the Roman Empire and the Gulf oil spill? I think now we can put the puzzle together. First, both involved increasing complexity to solve problems. In both, complexity generates increasing costs and diminishing returns. Thirdly, it takes resources to support complexity and solve problems, but the resources become harder to get. Fourthly, in both cases, we solve today's problems by shifting costs onto the future. The Romans did this by debasement, while our national governments today do it by borrowing. And fifthly, in both cases, complexity and declining energy return on investment generate economic weakness and undermine sustainability. So to conclude with some final remarks, firstly, the most important key to the future of all of us, the entire world, wealthy nations, middle nations, poorer nations, is energy. Secondly, energy pays for complexity in problem solving, whether it is solar energy of the moment or solar energy of the past embodied in fossil fuels. And thirdly, we are wrapped up in the economic problems of today, but we should remember that the key to our long-term future is energy. Energy must always be our number one priority. Whatever. And I thank you.